And answer section after the talk, and you're welcome to contribute. And without further ado, to the man who needs no introduction and the friend of Fidel Castro, George Galloway.
Thank you, Camilla. I'm not sure how well this mic is working, but I'll do my best to be heard, whether it's working or not. As half an Irish man myself, I'm particularly grateful to the Camden Irish Centre for affording us this wonderful venue for this auspicious occasion. This is going to be a long speech because it's about Fidel Castro, who lived a long life and whom I had the honor to know well and across many decades. And even however long it is, it could not do justice to the phenomenal life of this great man who we learned last Saturday morning of his demise. I knew that something big had happened when I woke up around 7 in the morning to discover that my phone had been ringing from 5 in the morning and that there were literally scores of messages from people informing me that Fidel had passed. By chance, my comrades in the various solidarity movements had convened that day the Latin American Conference in central London, an annual event of some importance which suddenly assumed a special character, having been convened on the day of Fidel Castro's death. I gave my first speech to that conference around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Before I did so, I had given 23 interviews to television, radio, newspapers, and magazines. So I already knew by Saturday afternoon that a major job of disinformation, of distortion of the life and achievements of Fidel Castro and of the Cuban Revolution was underway. The levels of pre-prepared hypocrisy were frankly staggering even for me, who has spent a lifetime in the face of those double standards, that hypocrisy. It's difficult to know where to start on the 23 interviews. Let's start with, in a way, the most banal. Apparently, Castro's Cuba was some kind of hellhole for gay people, for homosexuals. Notwithstanding the fact that Raúl Castro's daughter, the president of Cuba's daughter, is the leader of the LGBT movement in Cuba, leads parades, festivals, meetings, conferences on those issues that matter particularly to that community. Notwithstanding that in Florida, to which the gold-toothed Scarfaces scarpered after the triumph of the revolution, homosexuality remains illegal in states all over the United States. Gay relations, never mind marriage between gay people remains illegal, notwithstanding that Cuba legalized homosexuality before Scotland did. I had to face in 23 straight interviews the false lie that Cuba had some particular animus against gay people. And I promise you this, I'm not giving away any secrets, I would never do that. But the British government, in a calculated insult, has sent little Sir Alan Duncan as their representative to Fidel's funeral. Sir Alan is a gay man. I promise you, Alan, you'll have a better time in Cuba than you would in many other places. It is a pity that the British government have sent such a low level, and I'm not referring to his size, a low-level delegation to the funeral. It's a pity too that Jeremy Corbyn has sent somebody who hates Fidel Castro and everything he stood for to represent the official opposition, Emily Thornberry, who has had nothing in her life but bad things to say about Cuba and about Fidel. Both of these things are pity. But I promise you, the British government is not uppermost in the mind of the Cuban people in these next couple of days. The second lie, even more heinous, which every single one, I mean it, of 23 interviews, and that's just the ones I did before 3 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, put to me as fact that torture was the norm for political prisoners in Cuba. Quite apart from the fact that there is absolutely no torture in any Cuban prison, the only torture that exists on the island of Cuba is in the American hellhole called Guantanamo Bay. Yet American journalists were putting to me, imagine, the effrontery of asking about torture in Cuba when your own government and your own president, who ran for office on the pledge that he would close that torture camp at Guantanamo Bay, but has instead extended it and invested $150 million in making it even more secure. People who've just seen an election in the United States of America in which more than $2 billion was spent, where the candidate who got most votes lost, where there's widespread suspicion of electoral malpractice which the courts are refusing to address, some of them anyway, in terms of recounts, in the land of the hanging Chad, in the land where George Bush stole the presidency of the United States, they're asking about democracy. Asking about democracy in the land closer to Cuba than Glasgow is to Edinburgh, imagine, and which has maintained for almost 60 years a state of siege, subversion, invasion, assassination, terrorism against its tiny neighbor of 11 million people just off the coast of Florida. Well, as I said on Saturday, the Second World War is my speciality. When the barbarians were at the gates in the Channel ports, besieging us in 1940, when we stood alone against the fascist hordes. There wasn't much democracy, and there weren't many civil rights in Britain. This day, on our Sputnik show on RT, which you can see again later this evening, we interview a man whose father was interned throughout the Second World War without charge or trial, and rightly so, because he was a fascist who wished the victory of those who were besieging us at the Channel ports. He wished the victory of those who wished to invade us, subjugate us, and crush our resistance. There were no elections in Britain in the Second World War. The Parliament elected in 1935 was the Parliament that finished the war in 1945. When members died, there were by-elections, sure, but the main parties didn't contest them against each other, and only fringe candidates, who sometimes won, by the way, stood in those elections. Nobody was allowed to go around the East End handing out leaflets, asking for people to support those who were besieging us. Nobody had free speech in the Second World War in Britain, because when you're under siege, under threat of invasion and occupation and annihilation, one thing matters more than anything else, and that is the defense of the territory, the sovereignty, and the lives of the people for whom you are responsible. Why would it be any different for Cuba? And on it went. All these familiar lies. Human rights, human rights, human rights. As if having the right for your baby to survive birth and infancy was not a human right. Infant mortality in Cuba is lower than it is in the United States of America. That's a human right. Living a long life, as Fidel did, is a human right. Life expectancy in Cuba, a poor country in the third world, in the global south, is greater than it is in the United States. I heard someone say on the radio coming here, the Cuban health system was the finest in the region. No, it's one of the finest in the entire world. Comparable to Scandinavia and highly developed social democratic countries in the developed world. That's why people go from all over the world to Cuba to be treated. Cuba's greatest export is not tobacco, it's not rum, it's doctors. And you've heard me say maybe about the greatest miracle of them all, Operation Miracle, whereby Cuban doctors and nurses go all over the world to cure blindness in people who only need a cataract operation, but for whom such an operation is wildly beyond their dreams. Free of charge, 2 million people, poor people, have walked in blind and walked out with sight. These are human rights too. It's a human right to have a free kindergarten. As you saw, I have myself now a small child and another coming. Trust me, kindergartens ain't free here. Neither, frankly, can it be gainsaid that in the Cuban education system, the poorest child in the remotest place will receive not just a free kindergarten and a free primary school and a free secondary school and a free university and a free PhD. They will be fed and given milk and meat every day in every one of those institutions. I once visited, on one of my many visits to Cuba, a very poor barrio called Orange River on the outskirts of Havana. I went to visit a primary school in a poor country, in a third world country. And the teacher, whilst talking to me, began to cry. Tears ran down her face. This was in the special period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Cuba lost about 80% of its trade. She started crying as she told me that yes, they were still managing to give milk to the children, but they'd had to lose meat on 2 days of the week in the free school dinners that all of these children received. I had to tell her that Margaret Thatcher took our milk in 1973 in one of the richest capitalist countries in the world, so not to be too hard on herself. I'll tell you a story. I was a guest on the first Cubana flight, direct flight from London to Havana, now sadly not with us. I was in first class. I know. Hardly anybody was there. The staff, the entire cabin crew, as soon as we'd got into the air, ignored all calls on the push button for water or food and lined up in the first 2 rows in first class, all of them, to watch an opera, which they watched for hours on the way to Cuba, which showed you 2 things. The attitude to service in socialist countries and the cultural level of the Cuban workers. They weren't watching football, as I would have been, or a soap. They were watching opera, transfixed for hours into the journey. That's a human right for working class people to access the culture that used to be the exclusive province of the ruling elite, to which I shall come in a few minutes. It's a human right to be able to access freely sport, in which Cuba has become an international superstar. No one has to worry whether they can afford the track shoes or the equipment or the boxing gloves, all the things that would trouble working people, poor people here in this country. These are all human rights. Now, nobody, least of all Fidel himself, would deny there are some things that are regarded as human rights here that cannot, in some cases, should not be practiced in Cuba. And I'm not going to shy away from those. I'm just going to preface my discussion of those with this category point, this conceptual point. As I got to wondering why this wave of hostility was coming my way last Saturday, I realized that actually this controversy over Cuba was part of a bigger question the biggest question of them all. The balance between individualism and collectivism. The us and always versus the me and now. Let me give some examples. It's true that until comparatively recently, and even now with some restrictions, no one in Cuba is free to set up a capitalist business. No one is free to establish a pro-American political party. These are, no doubt, restrictions on individual actions. But they are, if you'll forgive the pun, trumped by the interests of the society as a whole. The society as a whole concludes that a return to capitalism as it existed in Cuba before, as it exists throughout Latin America and the wider world now, is not in the interests of the Cuban people as a whole. That the state must guide the economy. That the blind, cruel, heartless, inhuman forces of the free market are not the best interests of the Cuban people. Now, personally, I believe that myself. Indeed, one of the real reasons why so much misery exists in Cuba's region, in the global south, and in the west, is that we have subjected ourselves to the idea that the market is king, that the dollar is God, and that if someone can become a successful capitalist by exploiting the resources and the labor of others, they must be allowed to be. Well, that's a philosophical point of view. It's not mine. And moreover, I would argue that the evidence that that system is not in the interests of the majority of the people in the country is so huge a body of evidence that it scarcely needs much analysis. As Fidel himself said, people talk about the problems of socialism, of which there are many, but we never hear them talk about the failures of capitalism. And let's now take a look at the Cuba that existed before 1959. Cuba was just a playground for the rich and the corrupt and the criminal in Latin America, and in particularly in the United States. Most people's experience of that is a few minutes in Godfather 2 on the roof of a hotel where the mafia bosses have a cake in the shape of Cuba, literally, and cut it up, literally. You, Traficante, will take these casinos and these hotels. You, Mayor Lansky, will have these. You, Mr. Corrupt US politician that we brought with us, en route to the bordello, you can have a piece of this action or that. Cuba was a casino, a bordello for the worst people on the earth. Cuba had, in 1958, until the triumph of the revolution, an actual system of apartheid. People of color could not piss in the same pot as white people. They could not go into the same park as white people. They could not live in the same place, even if they had money, as white people. Institutionalized apartheid existed in Cuba before the triumph of the revolution. The vast majority of people lived lives of total impoverishment, and the average life expectancy was 47. Now it is 86 in just 60 years. How's that for a transformation? How's that for human rights? The right to be alive, to be sure you can eat tomorrow. There's one poster I love in Havana. It has a picture of a child. It says, 115 million children in the world go to work instead of school. None of them are in Cuba. No child in Cuba has to go to work rather than go to school. How's that for human rights? Cuba was utterly transformed by the Cuban Revolution. Fidel would be the last to say that all of that was down to him. But equally, now that he's gone, we cannot refrain from saying that if not for Fidel Castro, the Cuban Revolution might well have fallen long ago, because Fidel was a man of such giganticness, a gigantic character, physically, intellectually, morally, in terms of his aura. If any of you have met him, you know that what I'm saying is true. That he was a man the likes of which you don't see in 1,000 years. He was regarded by the Cuban Revolution, by the Cuban bourgeoisie, that the revolution turned out as a traitor. What did they mean by traitor? They meant it on two levels. First of all, he was a traitor to his class, and second, he was a traitor to his race, because he liberated black and indigenous people and spent his entire life working for the poor. And his enormous personality had another most unusual, I certainly mean no disrespect to any people from Latin America here, but like many other people, my own included, quite often in Latin America, people paint with a broad brush. They look at the big picture rather than the details. Fidel Castro was the most meticulous attender to detail that you could possibly imagine. And he turned the Cubans into exactly that kind of people. This is one of his achievements. You know, mañana, Bukara, inshallah, tomorrow, God willing, later, over 1 million. These kind of phrases and concepts don't exist in Cuba anymore. On the day that this picture that I'm so proud of me with Fidel was taken, and I'll come back to the story in a minute, but just to digress, to make my point, I was for 7 hours. This is why Fidel's speeches were so long, by the way. Not because of excess wind, but because he went into such microscopic detail about every problem in every area in Cuba, so that people could understand the scale of the problems, the nature of the problems, and be harnessed into their solution. But in this 7-hour TV show that I did with him, called Redondo, the manager of the central bank had a passing role. He came and sat down, he gave some words, and he used this phrase, over 900 million. And Fidel asked him, what do you mean by over 900 million? 901 or 999? Be exact, man, he said. The bank manager was embarrassed. He was not quite as exact as his boss. One of the phenomenal things about Fidel's character was not just that he was a walking history book, a repository of so many dramatic things that had happened in the world, a man that had been the center of so many dramatic things, but his curiosity to know from you that which you knew and he imagined he did not. That sometimes didn't work, especially with me. Once he asked me, what's the total oil production in the North Sea? I couldn't have told him to the nearest ocean. And I had finally to say, because I couldn't take a guess on it, I had finally to say, actually, I don't know. And he looked at me as if to say, are you sure you're a British MP? He then asked me the total steel tonnage from the British steel industry. And I couldn't answer that either. Finally, he took out a map of Britain, literally, on his desk, and spread it out. And he said, you know those cows with the long hair and the big horns? Where would we find them? In Europe. That I could answer, and I pointed vaguely to the north of Scotland. He didn't just want to tell you things, he wanted to learn things from you. And he had the kind of mind which absorbed detailed information, which he could recycle from decades before. He could tell you what Khrushchev said in such and such a place, exactly verbatim, decades after the events in question. Trust me, if you never met him, you'll never meet anybody like Fidel Castro. He was the greatest man by a country mile that I ever met. And I'm so very sorry that I will not have the chance to talk with him again. I met him, by the grace of God, many times over decades, from the 1980s through the 90s, and several times in the first decade of this century, and last in 2006 when I was working on this book. He told me so many stories. It would take me all day to retell them. Some of them are in the book, but they're better told. Let me just tell you one or two. Is this mine?
Yes, it is yours.
Fabulous. Let me just tell you one or two. The meetings were long, if he liked you. It was my very good luck that the first time I met Fidel, around 1985, he liked me. So whenever I was in Cuba, he always made time to see me, and the meetings got longer and longer and longer until they were all night. Fidel was a very nocturnal person. Once we were in his office in the Central Committee building in the center of Havana in Revolution Square, just off Revolution Square, where the big Che Guevara image is. Incidentally, there are no images of Fidel in Cuba. So much for a dictator, so much for a personality cult. The only pictures, the only statues, the only images of anybody in Cuba are of the dead revolutionary heroes. That doesn't happen often, frankly, in many countries around the world. But anyway, we were relaxing. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and CNN was on the television screen, when he suddenly stopped talking and looked transfixed at the TV. Finally, he said, that was Bill Clinton, out jogging, wearing a Malcolm X baseball cap. He said, if you had told me 30 years ago that the day would come when an American president would A, be out jogging, B, wearing a baseball cap, and C, having Malcolm X's face on it, I would have said you were insane. And that's what I'm watching now on the television. I asked him, did you ever meet Malcolm? He said, did I ever meet Malcolm? And he told me the following story, which I've always thought would make a fantastic movie. Right after the triumph of the revolution, the whole of the Cuban leadership went to New York for the United Nations General Assembly. All of them in their battle clothes and their military boots. The previous regime had always booked a hotel in Madison Avenue, so they took up the booking. And there they were in Congress, tramping up and down the stairs of this Madison Avenue hotel. And then outside gathered a crowd of the Scarfaces who'd run away from Cuba with their ill-gotten gains, who started protesting, throwing stones at the window. The manager of the hotel asked Fidel for a financial indemnity against any damage that these hooligans might do. Standing on the dignity of the revolution, Fidel refused. He said, it's your duty and your police's duty to protect us and to protect your property. Well, the man said, well, you'll have to leave. At which point, Malcolm X, with his bow tie and his little black hat, appeared at the hotel. Hearing of this dilemma, he told Fidel that the whole Cuban delegation was welcome to Harlem, to the Teresa Hotel, famous in the Spike Lee movie, the hotel where Malcolm has a gun in his hand and is looking through the curtains. A rather shady, slightly shabby hotel. But, explained Malcolm, you'll be very welcomed by the people there. Yes, said Fidel, ordering everyone to gather their things and head for Harlem. And of course, all the arriving international delegations wanted to see the new Cuban leadership, to make a call on them. So they all had to make a call on Harlem, which day after day was treated to fleets of limousines when some of the greatest figures of the time coming to see Fidel and the Cuban leaders. Tito, Zhou Enlai, the Russians, Mrs. Gandhi, her father, Mr. Nehru, and Mrs. Gandhi, all these huge figures had to journey to Harlem, where Malcolm X's men formed an honor guard outside, securing the perimeter, protecting the guests inside. He went on to say that in order to thank them, imagine if this had been filmed, the Cubans threw a garden party in Central Park for Malcolm X and his men, with military tables, canvas chairs, drinking from military canteens. Fidel was terrified the canteens would get mixed up and Malcolm's Muslims would take a slug of what turned out to be Cuban rum and vice versa. And they sat in Central Park and had a thank you lunch. The story is much longer, but finally I asked Fidel, so, in summary, what did you think of Malcolm X? He said, Malcolm was a great man, but he was a little dangerous. If Fidel Castro thought you were dangerous, you must have been bloody dangerous. He had all this knowledge. He knew all these people. It was impossible but to be almost silent and awestruck in his company. I want to close with some remarks on what for me as a non-Cuban are the most important parts of Castro's legacy. And they are the reason why, whilst nobody in Fleet Street is mourning the passing of Fidel Castro, people in countries they've never heard of and about which they care nothing are lowering their flags and bowing their heads in memory. I refer, of course, to the extraordinary internationalism of the Cuban Revolution. Nobody could have blamed the Cuban revolutionaries if they'd put all of their energies, all of their man and woman power into simply defending and improving their own country. But in fact, the Cubans left their bones and their blood on battlefields all over the world in an attempt to break out, to make beachheads in different parts of the world. Some of them are famous, but some of them are not. Very few know, for example, that Che Guevara led a Cuban battalion in the defense of the greatest of all African leaders, Patrice Lumumba, when imperialism overthrew and murdered him in the Congo, and installed the greatest thief of the 20th century, Mobutu Sese Seko, who stole $20 billion from his country, leaving it a bleeding basket case, which it still is. Cuba had no material interest in doing so, but because of its demography and because of the particular suffering of black people in Cuba, the Cuban revolutionaries felt a debt to Africa and to assist in its liberation. There were Cubans in Ghana helping Kwame Nkrumah to develop nuclear energy when he too was overthrown. There were Cuban fighters in Vietnam when Che warned at the United Nations, warned the US, we will give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Vietnams. He meant it. And Cubans gave their blood to assist in the liberation of Vietnam from colonial rule and the defeat of the United States aggression against it. In the Latin American subcontinent, of course, the contribution of the Cubans to successful transformation in country after country is well enough known. One of the greatest moments of my life was in Managua, Nicaragua in the 1980s, in a big field with 100,000 people, the Sandinista leadership up on a platform, under siege, under attack from the United States, murdering teachers, health workers, nuns, priests, the Contras, trying to drown the Sandinista revolution in blood, when over the field came the clatter of Cuban military helicopters being given by Cuba to Nicaragua to help it defend itself against this US aggression. When Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada, a British Commonwealth country, without even telling the British government that he was doing so, the Grenadian forces were quickly killed. But the Cuban laborers, building workers, who were building an airport for the Grenadian New Jewel government, refused to surrender and fought to the last man against the United States Marines. And they weren't even soldiers, they were building workers. Fought to the last man against this US invasion. But of course, the most famous of all is better known, but for which there appears to be no credit given. When Britain and America and France and all the developed capitalist countries in the world were allies of apartheid South Africa, were making money out of apartheid South Africa, were selling weapons to apartheid South Africa, the Cuban fighters were giving their life's blood on the battlefield to defeat and bring down apartheid. And they defeated the South African army in Angola and hastened the triumph of the popular revolution and transformation in South Africa and the defeat of apartheid. So that when Mandela was released from the dungeons of apartheid, all the hypocrite countries that had collaborated in his 27-year incarceration were rolling out red carpets, inviting him to come. Where did he go? He went to Havana, and he stood with Fidel, and they raised each other's hands. And Mandela said, "See how far we slaves have come." If Cuba had done nothing else, nothing, in the last 60 years, its contribution in the destruction of apartheid in South Africa would guarantee it its name written in the stars for eternity. But of course it did more, much more. I close with just two anecdotes, one of which I should have given earlier and forgot to do so. In Britain, social mobility, horrible phrase, is said to be lower than it has been since the Second World War. Let me tell you what social mobility means in Cuba. A friend of mine, can't be here, John Bevan, a fluent Spanish speaker, a great friend of Cuba, was in a remote part of the island in a hired car, trying to see parts that tourists never see. And on a long road, at the end of a very hot day, he saw two black women cane cutters walking down that road with their machetes over their shoulder, trudging homewards after a hard day in the fields. My comrade Bevan stopped to give them a lift, and because he could speak the lingo, got into intensive conversation with them. "It's wonderful," said one of the women, a cane cutter with her machete. "It's wonderful," she said, "how tourists are starting to come to this part of Cuba. We haven't seen many yet. Mind you," she said, "a lot of Cubans are now traveling around the world." "Oh yeah," said John Bevan. She said, "My daughter is a doctor working overseas, bringing medical assistance to poor people," she said, "in poor countries. She's been in 5 so far." Now let me run that past you again. In a poor, third world, global south country, under siege, subversion, invasion, assassination, unremitting hostility from the most powerful countries on the earth, the daughter of a black cane cutter is a doctor, and moreover is working. How's that for social mobility? And my last point, is this. According to the laws of aerodynamics, the bumblebee can't fly. It's a fact. Its wings are too short, its body too heavy. But it flies, and a beautiful sight it is. According to the laws of politics and economics, Cuba should have fallen long ago. After the fall of the Soviet Union, not many would have given tuppence for its chances of surviving. But the collapse of the Soviet Union and the special period actually opened up for Cuba entirely new avenues. And necessity being the mother of invention, in that very period, Cuba became the world leader in biosciences, medical sciences. They invented the treatment for diphtheria, for hepatitis B, and if an antidote to HIV is found anywhere, it will almost certainly be found first in Cuba. Their biotechnology industries and many others have raced ahead, not only of other poor countries, but of many rich ones too. On a clear day, from a high vantage point, it's possible to see from Cuba the island of Haiti, which had no Fidel Castro, had no Cuban Revolution, had no transformation. The average life expectancy there is still 47, where it was when Fidel Castro came to power. So I salute you, Comandante. You are the greatest of men, and you have not died. You will live forever in all of us. Thank you.
Okay, now we'll open the floor to questions. We'll take 3 questions at a time. Does anyone have any questions?
Questions? Take 3 and then so you first.
Where do you see the future of Cuba now that such a strong leader has passed? Is there someone that you see that will come to replace him with equal amount of power, or do you feel like they are going to be a threat from, say, America or anybody else that wants to get into Cuba and establish a different order?
Thank you.
Hi there, just a quick question. Although we can see that Cuba no longer has anti-homosexual laws, how do we justify in the past the use of anti-homosexual laws and also the use of mass executions?
You mean the anti-homosexual laws in Britain under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s?
Of course, I accept
Is that the ones you mean? Do you mean the anti-homosexual laws Margaret Thatcher introduced in Britain long after those laws had been removed in Cuba? Don't you think that's a bit of an unfair and frankly stupid question? Don't you think so? Don't you think it's frankly stupid to decontextualize any country's role in these matters? when Castro came to power in Latin America, as in the rest of the world, there was widespread discrimination, hatred, even chemical castration of homosexual people. In Britain, Alan Turing, one of the greatest of our sons, without whom we would have lost the Second World War, and I'd be speaking to you now in German, was chemically castrated in Britain in the 1950s. And you want to ask me about Fidel Castro in that regard? You are frankly being stupid. Now, what do you mean by mass executions? If you mean that the Batista dictatorship and its comprador and its fighting forces were executed in the Revolutionary War and immediately in its aftermath, so they were, and so they had to be. And that's one of the reasons why the Cuban Revolution has survived so long. Enough of them escaped to Havana to mount an invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs and killed hundreds of Cubans. You're smirking. You don't care about those executions, you see. You've come here with your liberal agenda to try and score points. The Cuban Revolution came to power in a brutal revolutionary fight to the death. Kill or be killed. The dictator, Batista, or the revolution. That was the choice. And I'm pleased to say the vast majority of Cubans took the right choice and are mourning Fidel today.
Mr. Galloway, very interesting talk. I want to start with a quote from one of my most favorite socialist authors, Edward Bernstein, who said that democracy is both the means and the ends by which socialism will be realized. Preconditions of Socialism, 1894. I want to ask you to consider a hypothesis, a hypothetical situation. The Sandinistas overthrew an American-backed Somoza regime. They experienced an American-sponsored imperial insurgency by the Contras. Nonetheless, and simultaneously post-revolution, they undertook very similar social policies to the Cuban Revolution, and they liberated people. My question to you is, why can we not understand that Fidel Castro's legacy was inherently tarnished by his failure to transition to democratic rule? The Sandinistas gave up rule, they voluntarily transferred democratic power, and then they regained it again. Why could Castro not do the same thing? And my second part of my question is this. You speak of human rights, but till his death, and in my view, again, this is a tarnish of his legacy, which, as we said, had some positive aspects, in particular the defeat of apartheid, the most disgusting system of rule we've ever seen in the 20th century after the Nazis. My question to you is this. He said up until his death that he stands with the Assad regime in Syria, which has killed 500,000 people. Disgusting. 500,000 people, including my friends, who got murdered in Syria.
Watching the wrong news.
No,
Yes,
no.
watching the wrong news.
I've seen people murdered in Syria. My friends have become refugees in Syria, and he stood with the Assad regime until the end.
Don't forget 397 MPs voted to bomb Syria.
This is not relevant. We're talking about human rights.
It's not relevant.
I'm not really any son.
Enough. You've hit the microphone for long enough. As for your hypothetical, if my auntie had balls, she'd be my uncle. The hypothetical possibility that you advance is not one that was open to Cuba. The United States did support the Contra revolution in Nicaragua, and you want to talk about dead friends? I have many. I've seen health workers in Nicaragua, their tongues hanging down their chest like neckties, their throats cut by American-sponsored terrorism. I've also seen that in Syria, by your friends.
My friends?
Yes, your friends.
Yes.
I've also seen it in Syria, and paid for by the very same people. So I've got news for you, sunshine. I also stand with Assad and against Assad and Al-Qaeda and the terrorist murderers that seek to destroy the multicultural, multi-faith character of Syria. And I spent the last couple of days in Dublin with the Patriarch of the Greek Catholic Church of Syria and the Patriarch of the Maronite Christian Church in Syria, sitting with them in their full vestments and regalia. And they asked me to tell you that for the Christian people of Syria, the defeat of the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, so-called revolution in Syria is an absolute imperative for them. And they asked me to tell you that. So, the Cubans chose their path. You think that Fidel's legacy is tarnished? I do not. I do not think the majority of the people in this hall think that. And I don't think the majority of the thousands watching now on the live stream think it either. I know that for millions of people around the world, they don't think it's tarnished either. They think that Fidel's name is written in the stars forevermore.
You're an apologist for genocide! How dare you stand with the Syrian regime? How dare you!
Now, I forgot to address the first question from the lady about what will happen now. Well, of course I don't know exactly what will happen now, and I definitely don't know who will happen now. But the one thing I'm certain of, whatever the future is, it will be decided by the Cubans themselves and nobody else. As the course of their last 60 years of history has been, so will the future. If Cuba were to decide, I don't believe that it will, to return to the capitalist road, that would be a matter for them. After all, the whole point of solidarity with someone else's sovereignty is so that they can make their own decisions about where to go next. But I believe that the Cuban masses know how precious the gains and achievements that they have made are. There are some, of course, as was the case in every country, is the case in every country, who prioritize Levi's or the latest Jennifer Lopez record, God forbid, over some of these social gains that I've been talking about. You'll always find that in any society. People say, well, why are Cubans trying to get to the United States? Frankly, if you landed a plane in Drumchapel in Glasgow and said to everyone in the estate, here's a green card, do you want to get on board and go to America? The plane would be full pretty damn quick, I can assure you. You'll always find that in every place. But I believe that the Cubans will hold fast to the course that they have been on. Raul, who was, of course, a commander in the Revolutionary Armed Forces, along with Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos and many other comandantes, some of them still around. They will, as they have for the last near decade, continue to run Cuba. Raul has said that he will step down, I think at the end of 2017, and there will be an orderly transition. The one thing I can promise you is this: the United States certainly won't dare to invade Cuba again. Everyone has a gun. We talk about the Second Amendment. Every Cuban is armed. Millions of them are members of the Cuban Communist Party. And if the Yankees want to come back for a second Bay of Pigs, they won't last long, I can promise you. So whatever other way they try, and they will, they've sent an even lower level delegation than Little Alan Duncan, as the British have, a calculated insult, in fact. But the Cuban people are steady, very clear, very practical and methodical. And Fidel has had a big part to play in inculcating these traits in the Cuban people. Quite unusual, as I say, not just in Latin America, but many other places too. And they will carefully calculate the future course of their revolution. Any others?
And what would happen to Guantanamo Bay? Is it likely to be closed down now with Trump? Is there going to be any discussion between Trump and...
The lady asked what will happen to Guantanamo Bay. It's a good question. I should have dealt with it because there's quite a bit of confusion out there. I've had people asking me on Twitter, why has Fidel tolerated Guantanamo Bay like he could do anything about it, short of engaging in an all-out war on the United States military, which would not be wise. Guantanamo was given to the US in perpetuity after the Cuban War of Independence against the Spanish colonials. The Cuban Revolution has asked every single year since 1959 the Americans to leave Guantanamo. They have always refused. They send a check every year for the rent on the base, which the Cubans send back and never cash. And so this will remain a considerable bone of contention standing in the way of normal relations between the US and Cuba. The current state of affairs should also not be underestimated, and I'm grateful to Rob Miller of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign for enlightening me in detail on this last Saturday. Under the so-called normalization of the late Obama period, when diplomatic relations were resumed, embassies reopened, the Miami Five sent home to Cuba, and an American spy released from Havana back to the US. Actually, the embargo, the blockade, has gotten worse, not better. And to my absolute astonishment, Rob told us last Saturday, the US has imposed fines totaling $20 billion on foreign companies just in the last 3 years. And worse than that, the foreign companies paid them. A state-owned bank in France, BNP Paribas, paid a fine to the US of $8 billion, earlier this year as punishment for trading with Cuba. Now, I don't know any Western government that's got $8 billion to throw away in the current conditions, but that's exactly what the French government did under a so-called socialist president earlier this year. So the embargo continues, and embargo is an act of war. If you effectively make it impossible, especially for an island people, to trade normally with other countries, then you are involved in continued acts of war, which makes the point I made right at the start, that whatever imperfections in Cuba's political development, they are entirely traceable to this completely abnormal state of affairs that exists between the US and Cuba. Any more?
Hello.
George.
I've been reviewing all these anti-Palestinian demonstrations and everything, and I'm just going to add this point. I'm originally from Kenya. In the 80s, we had an accident in Tanzania. In Arusha, we had an accident. We were taken to Mount Meru Hospital. My first encounter with Cubans was seeing like 15 doctors were Cubans, all the nurses were Cubans. That was in 1988 in Tanzania. So I think Fidel's legacy in Africa, Africans will witness a lot of it.
Fantastic. Does anyone remember Michael Moore's great film, Sicko?
Oh yeah, very good.
It's a fantastic film. But in it, Michael Moore takes these firefighters that were damaged on 9/11, plunging into the flames to try and save the people who had been murdered in the Twin Towers, but didn't have enough medical insurance to be properly treated in the United States, imagine. And he takes them on a boat to Guantanamo Bay, and he pulls the boat up to the frontier of Guantanamo Bay military base, and he shouts, "I understand you're giving the evildoers in there the very best of medical attention. That's at least what you say in your propaganda. Well, I have some firefighters here that were damaged by these evildoers on 9/11, and they can't afford to get treatment in the United States." And of course, they're turned away by the guards, and they go to Cuba, where they are all treated and cured, absolutely free of charge. And there's a priceless moment in the film where the injured firefighter, digging into his pocket, asks, "How much do we owe you?" And the Cuban doctors are completely nonplussed. What does this mean? What do you mean? How much do you owe us? And then they realize that this man, this patient, is offering money, imagining that that's the way things are and must be. And they patiently explain to him that in Cuba, nobody pays for healthcare.
So we have time for... Last question, and then there'll be a book signing with George Galloway at the back, where his book, the Fidel Castro Handbook, will be on sale also. Please go ahead.
Is it me?
Yes, your last question.
Oh yes, thank you for what you've just said. I remember too, just very, very briefly, the woman who was, same people you've just been talking about, the woman who the tears were streaming down her face from shame because the medicines that the Cubans had given her are only a few pence or whatever in Cuba, and they're so expensive and so beyond her reach in the United States. And then there was that moment when the Cuban, I think it was firefighters, pulled the guard of honour for all these American patients that were arriving. And these people had never been treated as though they were honorary citizens. And that was another very moving part of that film.
Absolutely. Well, they are very special people. When I went last Saturday night to the embassy to sign the book of condolence, and I think the Solidarity Campaign has their book of condolence at the back. When I went to sign it last Saturday, as I was in the room signing and reflecting on Fidel's life, the ambassador was behind me, and understandably very sad. And I said to her, and I say to you, as my last words in this meeting, that the Cubans are a truly special people, and their revolution is a truly special revolution. And that is in no small part because they had such a special leader who passed away last weekend. Thank you very much indeed.